If you're just starting out writing screenplays, then the first thing you need to understand is that a screenplay is not a novel. Keep in mind when you're writing your script, you always want to focus on showing instead of telling. The main difference between writing a novel and a screenplay is that when you write a novel, the prose is very detailed. It has to paint a picture for the reader and usually does that with a lot of aesthetic details. When you write a screenplay though, it's important that you ask yourself often if the story is visually adaptable to be on film or a movie. Now, before we start to write our screenplay, the first thing we're going to want to do is come up with a cool idea or a concept. When we're making our movie, we want to think of the finished product as like a beautiful mansion that we either want to show off to the world or we want to sell for a lot of money. The screenplay is going to be the blueprints, the foundation of everything. Before we even get to the screenplay or the blueprints of everything, we want to have an idea of what everything's going to look like, how it's going to feel. So let's start with baby steps. Get a pencil and some paper and write down in 1 or 2 sentences what your movie or your idea is about. Within those 1 or 2 sentences, you want to make sure that you define who the hero or protagonist is, what his or her goal is, and who the villain or antagonist or antagonistic force that's standing in that main character's way from achieving their goal. Once you've finished this, you've essentially created what's called a log line, or an elevator pitch. I've got a whole separate video on how to do this and refine this to the point where you can use it in a pitch and use it as a marketing tool in order to sell your screenplay. But later for that. Right now, we just want to get our rough idea down in 1 or 2 sentences so that we have a basis on which to build our foundation on. After you've written your log line, if you're still unclear on what your story is about or the events that are going to happen and in which sequence they're going to happen, then you might want to consider writing either an outline or a treatment. So you might ask, what is a story treatment? Think of your story treatment as your first sketch. It's only going to be about 2 to 5 pages, but it can be as long or as short as you want it to be. The purpose of this is just to get your thoughts down on paper so you can establish how the events in your story are going to flow. You can include snippets of dialogue if you come up with that along the way, but don't forget the idea here is just to keep your main focus on writing an overall summary of what your movie is about. It's not a scene-by-scene story summary that you're writing here either. You'll only focus on a few of your main characters and the key events that take place in your story. Since all great screenplays have a beginning, middle, and an end, you're going to start by writing 1-page double-space that focuses on each act. In a typical 3-act structure film, the first act you'll focus on setting up the story, getting the audience's attention, and introducing your main characters. The second act is going to be the middle part, and this is where you're going to complicate your protagonist's situation and elevate all of the conflict around them until it reaches a crisis point. Finally, in your third act, you'll focus on resolving that conflict and hopefully giving us a satisfying ending. If this isn't your style or you think that this is a lot of work or you want to just kind of jump right into it, you may want to consider writing an outline instead. An outline is just going to be where you can get into the specifics of what kind of scenes will happen at certain points of your story. Even though a screenplay is considered to be the blueprint of a movie before it's produced, you can think of an outline as just the blueprint of the screenplay, if that makes sense. Writing an outline can be as simple as just writing Act 1 and then kind of adding bulleted lists of events that happen for each scene. Do the same for Act 2 and Act 3, and when you're done, you'll have your outline. This is a great way to have a bird's eye view of each scene that happens in your story. An old tactic that's still useful is writing each scene of your movie on index cards so that you can easily move them around as you see fit. Alright, cool. So I know that was kind of a lot to take in and we haven't even started on page 1 of our screenplay, but Rome wasn't built in a day. When you look at how screenplays are written, you're going to notice that it's typically written in a certain type of format. It's got Courier font set to size 12. It's got 1.5-inch margins on the left side of the page, 1-inch margins on the right, top and bottom of the page. And there's a few other caveats that I'll have written out in the blog link below in the description. But for the most part, you don't have to worry about any of this if you just get screenwriting software. So your next question might be, well, what's the best screenwriting software to get? And the best answer for that question is going to be whichever one you can afford. Seriously, as long as it has the ability to convert your script to a PDF format, you're in good shape. Now, when you get on a level where you are working with producers and you're going to be switching screenplays back and forth and they need the actual working file in order to make adjustments and that type of thing, then you're probably going to want to go with Final Draft because that's what most industry professionals and producers use on a day-to-day basis. But for now, just get what you can afford. There's even some free software out there if you look. Generally speaking, your screenplay is going to be about 90 to 110 pages, give or take, just kind of based on whatever the genre is and what type of story you're trying to tell. In either case, the beginning is going to be typically about 25% of the story, the middle is going to be about 50%, and then the end is going to be about 25%. Again, I'm referencing the basic 3-act structure here. If we want to break a screenplay down, and I mean really drill down, screenplays are broken down into acts. Acts are broken down into sequences. Sequences are broken down into scenes, and scenes are broken down into beats. When we write a basic scene, it's going to consist of 3 main parts: the scene heading, the description or action lines, and the dialogue. The scene heading. Scene headings are also known as slug lines. They explain the when and the where to the reader. Whenever you write them, make sure it's in all capital letters and is included each time the story moves to a different location. For example, ext.coffeeshop-morning means that we're looking at the exterior location of a coffee shop. In this example, ext means exterior location. The next part describes the general location, and morning is the time of day. So from this basic scene heading, it's pretty obvious that the camera is outside of the coffee shop. If the scene were taking place inside the coffee shop, then you would type INT for interior in the prefix instead of EXT. Sometimes the action moves back and forth through a doorway or an opening. So in this scenario with the coffee shop, let's say your character is standing at the doorway and the action takes place between the exterior and the interior. In that particular situation, you would just type something like EXT/INT so that the reader knows that the action is taking place both outside and inside the location. So all in all, you have 3 parts of a scene heading. You have the location of the camera, which is represented by INT or EXT. Then you have the location of the actual scene, which is the place of where everything is happening. And the third part is going to be the time of day, which is day or night. A couple of things to keep in mind when you're writing your scene headings. Make sure that you kind of stick to maybe 2 or 3 words when you're describing the locations. That's not a hard rule, but you don't really need to be super specific, and at the same time, you don't have to be super generic either. But just write enough so the reader or director can get the picture of where the location is happening. Also, when you're describing the time of day, try to stay away from terms like dusk, dawn, late afternoon, early evening, high noon, gloaming, abstract stuff like that that makes it hard for someone to picture actually what time of day it is. Unless it's super critical to the story, just keep it to the basics. Day or night is cool. Now, occasionally the word same is used to indicate that the scene takes place at the same time or just after the previous scene. An example of this would be if I were to write something like int.joeysgarage-day, and then I wrote my scene out, and then the very next scene, I wrote something like int.sarahskitchen-same. So now when the reader gets to the Sarah's Kitchen scene, they know that this is actually taking place at the same time as the previous scene in Joey's garage. The word continuous is used for a similar purpose. It's used to kind of show the continuity between 2 different scenes. And there's also the word later, which will kind of describe a passage of time between 2 different scenes. So everything we just learned is called a master scene heading. That's because it identifies the master or primary location of the scene. But what if you have a secondary location within that particular scene, such as the living room of a house? Well, you don't have to write that entire scene over the way I just described it. A secondary scene heading is written in a more shorthand format, and sometimes it's considered a mini slug. So, for example, if you had a scene heading that was spelled out int.house-day, and then you wrote out your action lines and some dialogue, and say the character moved into the living room, then you would just simply type out living room in all caps and then hit return, and then you would type out everything that happens within the living room. From there, if the character went into the kitchen, you could simply just type something like in the kitchen or moves into the kitchen in all caps. So this comes in handy, especially when you're writing out action sequences or you just want to save some space. As long as you remember that the master scene is the primary location and the secondary headings go within the master scene. Once you change the camera placement though to an exterior location or to another location that's just not part of the master location, then you need to create a whole new master scene heading. If you have a scene that takes place in a certain time period, then another way you can write your scene heading is to type something like ext.Eiffel Tower -morning -winter, 1925. So this type of scene heading is good for like a dream or possibly a flashback, or just setting the scene and the tone for a very specific time. It's not just the Eiffel Tower here, it's the Eiffel Tower in a specific season and a certain type of year. So it gives the reader a good visual of how the Eiffel Tower might have looked back in that time period versus current times. Since I mentioned flashbacks, let's talk about a couple of different ways on how you can write those as well. In addition to the way I just explained it, you would probably want to add a dash and then the word flashback at the end of that particular scene heading. A second way to write flashbacks is to simply type out the word flashback, dash, and then what the actual flashback is. Then you want to hit enter and then type out the actual flashback. When you're finished typing out the flashback within about 4 or 5 lines, just go ahead and type out the word back to present day or back to scene. A third way to write flashbacks is to write the scene heading as you normally would and then put flashback in parentheses. Type out your scene, and then at the end, make sure that you put something like back to present day or back to scene. This is good for when you have several different types of scenes that are flashbacks. That way, when the reader is reading your script, they know exactly where they are in the timeline of your story. Like anything else, make sure you don't overdo it with the flashbacks. You can see how that can become really confusing if you have about 50 different flashbacks within your story. It's hard to keep up with the timeline of your story, and it takes away from everything that's happening. When you write a flashback, just make sure that there's some type of good payoff. The last two things I want to cover about secondary headings is montages and what's called a series of shots. A montage is just a compilation of short scenes or moments. It's basically going to be a sequence of shots that express the same or similar idea, such as a passage of time or some type of stream of consciousness. There's no real hard and fast rule on how these montages are formatted, but there's general expectations on how people are used to seeing them. Either way, you'd probably just write something like montage - Kenny and Diane running through the park. And then from there, you would just hit enter and then type out something like - Kenny and Diane run through the park holding hands, period. Once they stop, Diane surprises Kenny with a kiss on the cheek, period. Space, then do like a - which is a different shot. And then you could type something like Kenny and Diane share a hot dog together, period. Then let's do another space to add another shot, - Kenny gets down on one knee, comma, pulls out a ring, and Diane gasps in joy, period. We can see she says yes, and then he stands and they hug and kiss in front of a small crowd, period. Now, of course, you would end the montage by just typing something like "in montage" or "back to scene." And then from there, you would just type out your scene heading and get back to your story. When you're doing a series of shots, it's pretty much the same thing. It's just a lot more concise. You could type something like "series of shots" and then do a space, and you can either use like a dash or you can use a letter like A, kind of like a bulleted list, and then just list shots like Kenny runs through the park with Diane. Next shot could be B or a dash, and it could say something like Diane kisses Kenny on the cheek. The next one could be Kenny proposes to Diane in front of a small crowd. And then you could just end the scene the same way you do a montage by typing end scene or back to scene. So the difference between the two is that a montage is just a little bit more in detail, whereas a series of shots is kind of like a bulleted list of just single camera shots. All right, so that pretty much covers everything you need to know about how to create a primary scene heading and a secondary scene heading. The next thing you need to learn in order to create a full scene is how to write action lines, aka descriptions, and also how to write dialogue for your characters. So make sure to check out the next chapter. Now that you know how to write a scene heading, let's talk about the description. So once again, screenplays and television scripts are made up of three parts: the scene headings, the descriptions, aka action lines, and the dialogue. So the narrative description or action lines are always going to be written in present tense, and that's because when we're looking at a movie, we're looking at it in present tense. We're watching things as they're actually happening. When you write these out, make sure that you double space between the paragraphs, and you don't need to indent anything. The idea here is to keep your action lines nice and lean. You want to probably keep things to about 3 to 4 lines. It's not a hard rule, but this is a good way to kind of show brevity. Remember, we're not writing a novel here, and we want to make sure that the pacing in the story moves the reader along and everything's nice and tight. Big blocks of text are the quickest way to turn a reader off and make sure that someone doesn't actually make it all the way through your script. As a general rule of thumb, you want to think of each paragraph per beat of action or image as an individual camera shot. Remember, we're not writing a novel, so you need to be very visual whenever you write anything within these action lines. Do not write anything that we cannot physically see. That means if you have a character who has a certain type of thought or is feeling a certain way, you need to figure out a way to write that visually so that we can see what's happening. When a producer or a director is reading your script, they don't know how to film something where John feels sick. That leaves a lot up to interpretation. You need to physically show what John is doing that lets the reader know that he's sick. Is he vomiting? Is he turning green? Or is he sweating very hard? Something that shows a visual state. Also keep in mind, when you're writing your action lines or the description, you want to do 3 things. You want to make sure that you are describing your characters when we first meet them for the first time. You also want to make sure that you somehow describe the location so we have a sense of what this bar or coffee shop is like. Are there anything particular that is standing out that we need to pay attention to that's critical to the story? And you need to also describe everything that's happening within the particular scene as an action, which is why they call it action lines. Now, I know I mentioned brevity earlier in terms of when we write our action lines out, but there's a fine balancing act here because you need to make things nice and evocative. The action lines are going to be what also really engages the reader. So a lot of scripts suffer from being underwritten, and it's hard for the reader to kind of clearly visualize what's going on. You want to make sure that this is written in an engaging way, that it is very clear and it visualizes everything that's happening, and the person overall has a clear understanding of what's going on. The way you're gonna really achieve this is by using clever action verbs. You're not gonna use the typical progressive forms of written passive voice. Instead, you're gonna use more of an active voice. So instead of writing a basic action beat like Brian enters the bar, you're gonna spruce it up with a more creative action verb choice. So let's see, something like Brian pimps into the bar with a Kango hat, or Brian strides into the bar with confidence. You can see how the last 2 options show a lot more character than just someone simply entering a bar. Always remember, your thesaurus is your best friend. So let's take a look at one of my favorite scripts and movies, by the way, which is Logan. This is a good example of some very effective action lines throughout the script, in my opinion. Keep in mind, whenever you're writing your action lines in your screenplay, you're going to be doing a few different things. You're going to be creating an atmosphere at times. You're also going to be directing the camera without giving a whole bunch of different camera angles, and we'll get to that in a second. But you'll also be conveying the character of your characters within the story. You'll be conveying the character through their actions and the things that they do within the action lines. You'll also be directing the performances of the actors as well. So you'll be describing the types of things they do, the way they do it. We'll get to that right now. So right here, we have a good example of how this script is very visual, and you'll notice again, they don't write anything in their action lines that can't be filmed. It opens up with a big shot of a billboard here, and then it kind of goes to, again, we talked about this in my previous video as far as how to create a scene heading, where outside it's a vacant lot, the time of day is night, and it's kind of setting the atmosphere here by letting you know that the colored light from the billboard flickers over a bullet-riddled sign, Route 85, US border, El Paso, Texas. So right off the bat, we know that we're not in the best or safest part of town. Beneath the sign is a long black limousine. To me, this kind of symbolizes or hints at that maybe this is a camera panning down from the sign to this black limousine. So that it right there is a good example of kind of directing the camera without giving camera angles. So you'll notice that this is in all caps because the writer wants your attention to be drawn to this long black limousine. It's important. We'll see why. Also, remember that each action line represents a camera shot. So this line is a camera shot, this is a separate camera shot, this is a camera shot, this is a camera shot. So we go from this sign, which has bullets riddled over it. Then we kind of pan down or cut to a long black limousine. Then we go to this next action line that basically describes a van. Again, this is in all caps. They want you to pay attention to this. A van passes by blasting music, and basically, it goes off screen, which we see here. OS means off screen. A squeal of tires off screen. So this is another thing. This is representing the sound. So normally whenever there's sound effects or anything that we want to kind of happen, that we want it to be noticeable, then we'll put sounds in all caps as well. And OS, by the way, again, means it happened off screen. So basically, we're looking at the highway, a whole bunch of cars go by, this van goes by, then we hear the tire squeal, and it kind of pulls back into frame, and we see that 5 gangbangers get out and check the black limo. Then it goes to another shot where you can see where they're kind of checking the limo doors, looking in the windows. It's tinted, so they can't see inside. Now we go to inside the limo. Again, INT means interior. This is the location, which is the limo, and we have the time of day. Instead of having day or night, they put same. So again, same means that this is actually happening at the same time all of this is happening. So this scene that we're about to read is happening simultaneously as all of this is happening. So this is basically describing Logan, and it's got a close-up on his face. The reason I say that this is probably a close-up, once again kind of directing the camera, is that they put a sleeping man's face ratchets into frame. So they've hinted at the fact that this is possibly a camera close-up shot where we can see his eyes opening and that they're red. So normally when we describe a character for the first time, it goes, there'll be like a very interesting setup that describes and shows how, what the character is like through possibly things that they're wearing or their demeanor or their description, physical description. But with this movie, everybody knows who Wolverine is, at least the fans do. So they're only going to describe his state in this particular movie, which is he's typically in shape, physical, and just ready to beat anybody's ass at the drop of a dime. But here he's older and he's clutching the tequila bottle. So they're hinting at the fact that he is out of shape and not in his best of abilities. So again, I won't go through this whole script, but we can kind of see how some of the things that I've pointed out as far as like things that are written in all caps. Again, this is a sign or not a sound, but we see a booted leg steps out. Again, this is kind of hinting around that this shot is only focusing on the leg that's stepping out of the limo. And it goes on, but this is just a good example right off the bat. I've kind of showed you several different things that they've done on page 1 that kind of direct the camera, conveys character, and also directs the performances of some of the actors. All right, now we know how to create action lines. So if you've watched the previous video, then you also know how to create a scene heading as well. The next thing that we'll be covering is how to write dialogue. In the previous 2 videos, we mentioned how a screenplay is made up of 3 different parts: the scene headings, the descriptions or action lines, and dialogue. In this video, we're going to talk about how to format and write dialogue. So whenever you're writing your dialogue in a screenplay, keep in mind that it's always written underneath the character that's speaking it. The dialogue section itself has 3 different parts to it: the character caption, the actor's direction, and the character's actual speech. So the character's name or caption is sometimes called the character cue. It's going to be in all caps, and it's going to be the same throughout the entire script. If your character's name is Frank, but another character in the screenplay calls them by a nickname like Porkchop or Snoopy, then you're still going to refer to that character as Frank in the character cue. The only time you will put the character's nickname in the character cue is if every character in the screenplay refers to that character by that nickname. Below the character's name is where you'll type the actor's direction. This is always written in parentheticals. The purpose of the actor's direction gives the reader some type of clue as to the subtext or the attitude of the character. Keep in mind that you should use these sparingly. Don't overdo it. You don't want to get in the habit of telling the actors how they should be acting. The context of the description line should be clear enough that they already know what their motivation is. When it comes to the character's actual speech, this is pretty straightforward. If you're using any type of screenwriting software, then you don't need to worry about formatting. Normally, you're going to want to stay away from big blocks of text unless your character is given an actual speech, like on a forum or a panel in a scene or something like that. As you're writing your screenplay, just keep in mind that you always want to focus on showing and not telling. I said it before and I'll say it again. Screenwriting is a visual medium, so unlike novels, we're going to show as much as we can. If your characters are just telling your story instead of you actually writing it out and showing it through action, then you're doing it all wrong. At that point, it may as well just be a podcast, because we don't need to see anything that they're talking about if they're just going to tell us the story. When you're creating your characters, make sure that in your screenplay, each one of them has their own unique voice. It doesn't have to be a really major difference, but there does have to be some type of subtlety and some type of way we can tell the difference between each character. When you listen to people talk in real life, nobody really talks the same. If you listen closely, there's really subtle differences between the way each person pronounces their words. Grammar, dialects, accents, all those type of things can be ways you can differentiate your characters from one another. When you're writing your dialogue in your screenplay, forget about composition, grammar, and punctuation. None of that really applies when you're writing how people actually speak. When you listen to how people talk, rarely do they use proper grammar 100% of the time. They don't always finish their thoughts. Sometimes they interrupt themselves. They may talk with an accent. They might have a lisp. They might have a bad habit of repeating themselves. There's all types of ways you can explore and be creative with the way people talk. The worst thing you can do when you're writing your dialogue is make everybody sound the same. A good way to give your characters an original voice is to give them a specific tone. Even better, you can combine different types of tone. Say for instance, your character speaks with a laid-back type of tone. You could combine that with the fact that he is naive and has a naive type of tone as well. And when you do, that may influence how you actually write your lines and what you write when you're writing your dialogue. Another example could be if a character is arrogant. And then if you wanted to combine a second tone with the way he speaks, is that he could be fearless. Or he could have a creepy type of tone that's mixed in with his arrogance. That could make for a perfect serial killer if you think about it. Let's jump back to formatting for a second. When you're writing your dialogue and one of your characters is speaking but they're off screen, you're gonna type parentheses OS parentheses. What this means is that your character is speaking but they're not necessarily in the camera frame. We may be able to hear them, but we can't see them because they're not actually on the screen. This is another subtle way on how you can direct the camera without actually giving camera angles and direction. If your character is speaking and suddenly there's another voice that's off screen, that's a good way on how you can set up some type of anticipation or a surprise. Say for instance, a character's being called, he turns around and he gets punched in the face. Or even worse, he gets shot. These are just a couple of ideas. It doesn't have to be so violent, but keep in mind my favorite genres are crime thrillers, so hey. Similar to using the off-screen element in screenwriting, you have what is called a voiceover. This is probably the most obvious to you because you've most likely heard this in some of your favorite movies like Casino, Apocalypse Now, Avatar, Goodfellas, Fight Club, Twilight, or The Watchmen. A voiceover is basically when a character is not on screen and they're pretty much narrating the story. The way you're going to format this is you're going to type the character's name and then you're going to have parentheses, V, O, and then close parentheses. These are pretty much the basics when it comes to writing dialogue. Dialogue in screenwriting is really not anything that can be taught. It really just comes from a lot of practice and repetition. Getting things wrong and actually having people recite the dialogue, saying it yourself, seeing how it sounds coming out of your own mouth and out of an actor's mouth. And also from reading different scripts. You can read scripts from people like Tarantino, Aaron Sorkin, the Coen brothers, or David Mamet, just to name a few. I mentioned this before, but it also helps to just really become a student of listening to how different people talk. If you have some unique characters in mind and you don't really know how they should talk, try interviewing some people that you think have an interesting accent or they speak a certain type of way. Alright, before you go, make sure you jump on the mailing list so you can get your free screenwriter's checklist, which will help you before, during, and after your next big script. And you will also get a link to a free filmmaker's glossary, which gives you some insight on the basic terms used in the film industry. Oh yeah, and before I forget, if you're on the fence or struggling with any new movie ideas, or you're just questioning if the idea that you do have is strong enough, make sure you check out the ebook that I wrote on how to write stronger story concepts, themes, and log lines. And as usual, don't forget to hit that like button and leave me a comment. All right, peace.